Let's say hello and thank you very much for Manjir.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me and for coming out on this gorgeous evening. You are a very dedicated lot, I have to say. So in this group, we like to hear about truth, don't we? Yeah? Okay, we want to hear about truth, and we definitely want to know if anything has been covered up and kept from us, yeah? Right, okay, that's the sort of thing we're going to be hearing about tonight. So, a lot of you will probably know me speaking on AV4 and Glastonbury and Conscious TV about black holes. So, what's all this Shroud of Turin business then? Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about why it is that I'm talking about this in the first place. So, what is the Shroud of Turin anyway? And what is the science behind it all? So, when you go deeper and deeper into the science, I mean, I was not interested in the Shroud of Turin at all. When I started looking into it, I realised that there's been a massive cover-up. And the more I went into it, the more I also realised that the science is pretty amazing when you get into it. And has anybody come across the Shroud of Turin before? I've heard of it, yeah? Okay. Now, how many people think that it's right now, standing in the room, think that it's a medieval fake at this point? Yeah, okay. Right, quite a few of you. And how many people think that that's a fake because of the carbon dating that you've heard about? Yeah, okay, brilliant. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go into the science of it today and talk about that in more detail, and a brief history of what the Shroud is all about, and the evidence for it being older than the carbon dating, things like the Sudarium. And so I'm going to come up to a new mechanism of how the Shroud of Turin might have been created, and that is going to link with what you know me for, the black hole principle. So I've been speaking, have anybody heard me speak before? Yeah, I've seen an interview, yeah, brilliant, on black holes, so I'll go briefly into that as well. So, not all of it is going to be... So, just for those of you who want to just be reminded, that is what the Shroud of Turin looks like. I can't get that. So, it's this sort of long linen cloth that's got a double imprint of a full-length body on there. And this is a sort of face that you can see. And why am I discussing it anyway? Well, as I said, something really strange happened to me about 10 years ago. I was actually brought up in a Hindu family, and you know, from a very scientific background as well, working as a medical doctor, and I started to have visions of the... Oh, is that a bit better? Do we need this, or am I okay without it?
No, you need it.
I need it. Okay. I'm a bit croaky today, so...
Is that okay?
Is that better? Yeah. Okay. So, I started to have visions. I've been a mystic for since about 1992, when out of the blue, in medical school, I had a Kundalini experience, which woke me up spiritually. And I started to have, about 10 years ago, started to have visions of the crucifixion, just out of nowhere. And all sorts of strange scenes of sort of Mary Magdalene and all that sort of stuff. So I sort of thought, well, what's this got to do with me? Because I'm into science, I'm a scientific speaker, I'm a scientific author. I don't talk about religion, and I kind of like ignored it for quite a while. But after a bit, I started to realise this is actually leading to a book. So that's why I started to investigate the Shroud. That's why I started to look into it. For me, at first, like a lot of people, I had no interest in the Shroud. It was some sort of peripheral sort of object that had nothing to do with me, and I thought it was probably a fake. The carbon dating had come out, and like a lot of people, I just saw it as an object of no importance. But the more I looked into it, the more the science started to intrigue me. And eventually, I had a total aha moment, and I realised that is that better? Can you hear? Is that less better?
It's not definite.
It's not definite. And I realised when you put the black hole principle together with the Shroud of Turin, you end up getting perhaps a new mechanism for how the Shroud was created, and also new significance for what Christianity might be about, how it's got distorted over the years. So does that sound good? Yeah, okay, interesting, different. You won't see this anywhere else, by the way. Okay, so that's what I'm normally known for, black holes, as you know, talking about the black hole principle. So how many people have watched the film Zeitgeist and that sort of thing? Yeah? Okay. So a lot of that discusses that Jesus did not really exist, yeah? And that was a myth and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so I'm not disagreeing with that at all. When I actually started to have all these visions, I don't, as a result of that, go, right, okay, I've had these visions, therefore Jesus must exist. You know, I too am looking at it from a scientific perspective. So I go off and I do the research. So there's been a number of people in the last few years who, like Zeitgeist, well, who's the lady in Zeitgeist? Acharya S. She was the lady that provided some of the work for that. And also Timothy Freaky, I don't know if you've had him speak here. So a lot of these people are saying that Jesus didn't actually exist. Now, all I know is that I'm doing the research, and I've been studying the academics and some of the sort of research out there, and who actually say we have more evidence for Jesus than we have Julius Caesar. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? And if you go back far enough into the Gospels, you actually find out that the Gospels existed within about 30 years of Jesus' death, supposed death. And you also find out that some of the Gospels, we read them in English, yeah? So we don't know that some of the Greek Gospels actually have the Aramaic phrases in there. They still have them in there. Because what the Greek scribes were writing down were actually stories that were circulated in Aramaic. So that's something that you're probably not aware of unless you actually read Greek and Aramaic. How many people do that in this room?
What language is it?
Aramaic is a Semitic language that's similar to Hebrew, and it would have been the language that Jesus, if he was alive and if he existed, would have spoken. Okay, so it's also a myth that the people who say that Jesus did not exist are called mythicists. And one of the things that they say is that, well, if Jesus existed, then there would have been a record of him, because the Romans wrote down everything. And, therefore they would have definitely noted that there would have been a record of his execution, etc. Now, when you actually look into it, there's very few record about Jesus existing, about anyone who existed. The Romans didn't actually take that many records, it's a myth. Okay, there's only one mention of Pontius Pilate that we have, 2,000 years later. We know that he existed, but there's only one mention of him. They definitely did not take records of executions and things like that. So James, my partner, is at the back there. He actually came up with something quite clever. He said the idea that the Roman emperor was talking about some preacher in Galilee is similar to Tony Blair talking about someone like me. You know, so I'm not comparing myself to you, but I mean, if you think about it, I have a few Facebook followers and things like that, so you could say they were my followers. You know, I have people who are interested in my work, but Tony Blair probably never mentions me in his letters, or, David Cameron or anything like that. So you won't find me discussed in the official records, just as you wouldn't have found some preacher in some sleepy outposts of Galilee mentioned in the records of Roman emperor. So there's some evidence to show the Gospels, some of them are geographically correct at the time, so there's something being written at the time. Anybody heard of James, the brother of Jesus? Yeah? Okay. So although Jesus is not mentioned by historians at the time, James is. So we have authenticated letters of Paul in the New Testament who mentions meeting James. And we also have Josephus mentions the death of James. So that's around 60 AD. So if Jesus didn't exist, why do we have his brother mentioned? So there's those sorts of things. Now, I do believe some pagan attributes have been added to the religion later. That's absolutely something that I do think could have happened. So I pretty much have, and the myth idea also, the idea that Jesus is a myth, has only been around for about 200 years. If you go back far enough, it did not exist. And also, the particular burial practices which we'll discuss a bit later, they are accurate. The ones that are described in the Gospels are accurate to the time of Jesus, and those particular burial practices did not happen at any other time with Jews in Jerusalem. The shroud and the Sudarium themselves, when we go into them, they may actually be evidence. But at the end of the day, I am not here saying Jesus did or did not exist. I don't think at the moment you can say that from a scientific perspective. I still have an open mind to both of the sides. These are sort of sides at the moment. Timothy Freaky's book, and Professor Bart Ehrman, who's an academic, he's a very good writer, a very good communicator if you get hold of his books. He's actually written an actual whole response to all of this crowd of did Jesus exist or not. So I have had these visions, I've looked into it, but at the end of the day, I'm not standing here saying the shroud is authentically Jesus' burial shroud. Okay, so I just want to get that out of the way. And I'm not saying that Jesus definitely existed, because at the moment I don't think you can say that scientifically. But when you start looking into the shroud, some definitely interesting things occur. So anyway, so what is the shroud exactly? Well, if you look at the cloth, it has a rather distinctive weave. Anybody know about textiles? Because I don't. Okay, brilliant. So, yeah, do you know what that is? It's called a 3-to-1 herringbone weave linen, and it's not local to the area where Jesus was supposed to have lived. So it's some sort of high quality from Syria or Palestine, and there are cotton traces present. Which means that it was from a large loom and cotton was not produced in Europe at that time. So already we've got some sort of evidence that it wasn't created in medieval Europe. It also has a side strip that's not the same length or composition. That's the side strip down there. So it's got water stains on the cloth, which I don't know if you've ever seen this, but the water stains indicate, and you can actually reproduce this, it was actually folded in a way that, have you ever seen things like the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like that? The way that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in these long jars, yeah? And this shroud was actually obviously put into a long jar like that, folded up concertina and stored at some point in a long jar, because we can tell this because of the water stains exactly match if it was put into this jar and some water was in the bottom of the jar. Okay, so that's the way things used to get stored at that particular time in that particular geographical area. So far, a lot of the stuff is actually matching. So the image is actually being enhanced here, but this is the image, the actual image there on the left. So it's a very faint sepia colour, and it's not seen unless you're actually at a distance. If you're close up, you can't actually see it. So very interesting. The image actually contains inanimate objects and animate objects as well. So it contains, but there's strange sorts of features of it, like there's no neck on the image. There's a plaque that actually appears, and there's no eyebrows. And there's also coins that appear on the image that are actually placed on the eyes of this man. Okay, so this is how the linen would have been placed around the head. That's a sort of image from the 16th century. So it's a full body of a naked man, front and back, as if he's been wrapped around from the head at the fold. There's no distortion on the image. So you've got an image of the front and the image of the back. Now, if you can imagine, if somebody's been laid down, those muscles would be quite bunched up, wouldn't they? You know, they'd be flattened. If you think about if they're lying down, the muscles at the back would be flattened. There's no distortion on the image to show that these muscles have been flattened. So that's another sort of very weird sort of feature of the shroud. And there's no image from the side of the body. So kind of strange features there. So that's another sort of example of what that would have looked like. And there's also blood present. So strangely, because Jews at that time would normally wash the body, but the blood is actually present. For some reason, they've not washed the body of whoever this person is, if it is an actual image of somebody who's been crucified. So the image is also... What do you think the image is? Has anybody got any ideas at this point? what you think the image is created by? No?
Sweat.
Sweat, right?
Well, I thought that it's a three-dimensional image created with a lensing effect.
Right. Right, sorry. With a lensing hook. So almost like lasers?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, there's a possibility, yeah. Anybody else? Okay. Well, the image is actually only... Oh, sorry, did you want to say something? Yeah, okay.
Someone's claimed it was the person who started the Knights Templars. Have you heard that theory?
Jacques de Molay.
Yeah. I'll come into that a bit later, yeah. So, the image is actually very, very... Can you see those little dots? That's what the image is made up of. And after scientific analysis, we realised that it's not a paint, it's not anything on there. It's the actual linen fibres themselves that have gone through, for some reason, they've reacted with something and gone through a very rapid oxidation and degradation. Very, very quickly aged, for some reason. Very quickly aged. And it's only on the very, very, very top layer. You know, you can't get any thinner than that. It's actually on the top layer, which means it can't be any sort of paint, because paint would actually seep into the cloth. Okay, so very, very strange. You've never really seen anything like this before. It's also a pixelated picture, much like you see on your newspapers and things, and it's slightly different colour in places. So I'm going to just check that I've got my sound up. I'll just play this for you. Oops.
And the picture
Let me just
element.
take that back again.
The shroud image is made from tiny fibers that are 1/10 the size of a human hair. And the picture elements are actually randomly distributed like the dots in your newspaper photograph or magazine photograph. To do this, you would need an incredibly accurate atomic laser. This technology does not exist.
Okay, so that's just one example of the sort of scientific analysis that people have gone into now as an optical engineer. It's interesting because the actual church, the actual Pope, is sort of saying, well, we don't know what it is, it's probably a fake. It's the scientists that go, hang on a minute, this is really weird, we can't explain this. So it's like complete opposite of what you might see, and a lot of people are accusing the church itself of doing some sort of cover-up. So that's an optical engineer who said the sort of accurate laser that you'd need to create this image does not exist at this point. We cannot recreate this image by any means that we know of at this particular time. So, yeah, intriguing, yeah? So the more you go into the science, the more it starts to open up. What you're told in the headlines in the newspapers is don't think about it, but actually when you look at it yourself, it starts to actually get pretty intriguing. So the story of the image actually tells a story of a crucified man, and sorry, this is quite a gruesome story. It's also completely unique in that when we found the remains of other crucified people from that era, which is pretty hard because crucified people were actually the nails were taken out and they were put into mass graves a lot of the time, not like, you know, the Jesus story found, you know, Joseph of Arimathea was supposed to have found a nice family tomb for him and put him in there. Basically, when we've actually found other crucified remains, we've actually found that their legs are broken, that they maybe have been hung upside down. There's a different story. But strangely, the story of this man on this shroud fits the story of Jesus in the Gospels, which is pretty strange. So that's pretty unique. It doesn't mean that it is Jesus, that's not what I'm saying, but it actually fits the Gospels. It's got incredible detail on it, which would be hard to fake now, let alone in the medieval times. So it shows the story of somebody who's been whipped. We can even tell this person has been whipped by two people, one standing either side, and one of the people who was doing the whipping was taller than the other. And the back of the shroud shows that there were gumball marks from a Roman instrument called a flagrum, which I'll show a film of a bit later. Now, somebody in the medieval times, they didn't think like that. They didn't think like with forensic accuracy. You know, so I mean, it's possible they could have got hold of the flagrum, but it's really unlikely that they could have done that. And how would they have done that anyway? You know, we don't know how they created this image. Once we've actually looked at this scientifically and actually, you know, created three-dimensional imaging, which I'll go into, there's actually a cap of thorns on this person, not a ring of thorns. And if you think about it, all our imagery of Jesus shows that there's a ring of thorns on his head. But actually there's a cap of thorns, which is actually more in keeping with the sort of Roman ideals, the pagan crowns that they were using at the time. So, you know, it's not a detail that we would normally think of today, let alone a medieval forger. So there's also abrasions on the back that we can see. And this is when somebody's been carrying a cross on their back, which often the Romans made them do. And I'm sorry to go into gruesome detail, but this is a picture of somebody who's probably been crucified that we're looking at. And what would happen was the nail would go through the feet, the nail would go through the wrists, and the person would move up and down to try and help themselves breathe. Then the pain would be so bad and they'd move down again. So this was an agonising death, and I'm sorry, it is very gruesome. I hope it doesn't disturb your dinner. But it's, you know, we are dealing with something that is not a very nice way to die. So we're looking at an image of something that is possibly a crucified person, and this is the story that it's telling. And the legs are not broken, which is quite common for people who were crucified. But if you note, it says in the gospel story that Jesus' legs were not broken. So the incredible detail that we can see on this cloth is so great that we can actually do a sort of forensic story of this person. So would you like to say, I'll just show you this film. This is an actual forensic pathologist who is doing an analysis.
This is the body of a 5-foot, 11-inch Caucasian male weighing about 170 pounds. On the head, there are blood flows from numerous puncture wounds on the front, back, and top of the head. There's a swelling over one cheek, consistent with a beating. The right wrist is covered by the left hand, but there's a puncture wound in the left wrist, consistent with a crucifixion injury. The classical, artistic, and legendary portrayal of nails through the palms is incorrect, because the structures in the hand are too fragile to hold up the weight of a man of this size without tearing free. There are streams of blood running down both forearms, originating in the wrist areas and controlled by gravity, so the blood flows toward the elbows with the arms elevated and outstretched. On the back, there are more than 100 lesions which appear to be scourge or whip marks. Historians have indicated that the Romans used a whip called a flagrum. This implement had 2 or 3 thongs, and at their ends were pieces of metal or bone which looked like small dumbbells. Here you can see how those end pieces from a Roman flagrum fit precisely into the scourge lesions on the body. Here on the front of the body is a large blood stain resulting from puncture of the chest by an instrument like a lance or a spear. This weapon penetrated the thoracic cavity through the pleural spaces and into the heart. Later, after the corpse was removed from the cross and turned, blood dribbled out of the chest wound and puddled along the small of the back. There's an abrasion of one knee consistent with a fall. Finally, a spike has been driven through both feet and blood leaked from those areas and has stained the cloth. The evidence of a scourged man who was crucified and who died of postural asphyxia and cardiopulmonary failure is clear-cut.
Okay, so it's not...
Did he say Caucasian now?
Yeah.
He said 5'11" Caucasian.
Yeah.
Caucasian doesn't mean white. Okay, Caucasian. I'm Caucasian. If you're talking about genetic terms, a lot of people think Caucasian means white. It doesn't. It means everything from Asian Asia to Middle East. That's all Caucasian. So the genetic term has been used as has been taken and used as a euphemism for white, but that's not what it means in genetics. So it's a common. I mean, it's just come into our actual. What's unusual though is whoever it is on the shroud is very tall, and I suppose the person's about 5'7", so people sort of mistake that. Now I want to just point out and emphasise again. Whoever is on this shroud, sorry to go into great detail, but we are talking about. So is this too gruesome for people? No, okay. So whoever is on this image shows a contraction of the thumb. Okay, so the thumbs are contracted inwards. Okay, and this is due to a ruptured median nerve, the median nerve running through the wrist there. Now. People have actually taken corpses, and it sounds very, very gruesome, but they've actually put the nails through the hands and the nails through the wrist, and they've tested this out and tested to see if it would take the body weight. It will not take the body weight through the actual palm, which is what we see in all medieval art, is it not? So if this was a medieval forger, you'd think that they'd put the nails through the palm, and that's where you'd see the nail marks and the blood flowing from. But actually, what we actually see on the shroud is it going through something called the space of Destot, which is an anatomical space which we don't have any use for. It's something that people have forgotten about. The Romans knew about this because they used it for crucifixion. Okay, so they knew about this space, and they knew it was strong enough to hold up the body weight. So, sorry, I keep holding the microphone too close. So they knew it could hold up. So that's a detail that is absolutely incredible, and something that medieval people, it's possible that they would have known about it, but it's highly unlikely. So we've got some details here that if you go into the details, it starts to unfold as pretty bizarre for a medieval mind. Even a mind of today, most people would say, well, Jesus had the nails through the cross. So if somebody was trying to make a picture of Jesus, they'd probably do that, wouldn't they? They wouldn't put it through the wrist. So the cause of death, asphyxiation, hypovolemic shock, as they said. The wound to the side is interesting because you see the flow of fluid, which is people have said it's either pericardial from the heart or it's pleural. So that fits with the description of the lance going into Jesus when he was on the cross. But interestingly, this has only come to light after we've used UV light on the shroud. So whoever forged this, if they did it in medieval times, they hid something that would only be discovered as a detail in the 20th century. When a UV light. So they had to predict the use of UV light on the shroud in order to put this little detail there. So you can actually see this flow, and so that absolutely fits the description that we have in our Gospels. That I think, was it called Longinus? Put a lance into the side of Jesus and fluid came out, clear fluid came out, that's a description. Weirdly, that's what we see on the shroud, but it's only visible with UV light. Okay, so the blood flows show a person with arms outstretched initially and lying down for a while, which actually fits with the Sudarium picture, which I'll go into soon. So I spoke about the coins that are on the eyes there. Now, some people have done this imaging analysis of the coins, and I'm not sure how convinced I am about this, but they seem to think this looks like the coins from Pontius Pilate's time. We've got very few of these coins, but Pontius Pilate was only the local ruler from about 29 to 33 AD. So this tradition of putting coins on eyes in order to pay the ferrymen or whatever. So this person on the shroud has got coins on their eyes, and it fits with the period and the locality. So I'm going to go into this. So that's a shroud. That's an actual short description. And would you agree that? I mean, has everybody heard more detail than they've heard before?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, it's pretty bizarre. I'm not standing here saying this is Jesus or this is definitely real, but it's kind of interesting. And what you're told in the headlines does not go into the great detail. If you actually study it, it gets weirder and weirder. So when they tell you, oh, it's a fake, blah, 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 think again, because it's not so easy to describe it. What have I caught onto? Sorry, I keep sticking onto your... Can I put that there? Okay. So I'm going to come into the scientific era now. Why is it that the church is not that interested in it, and the scientists are? Well, it all started with a guy called Secondo Pia in 1898, who at the time the shroud was actually in the hands of a royal family, and asked this I think it was a king actually, asked him if he could photograph the shroud. And so he was really the first person to realise there was something very bizarre going on with the shroud. Because when he came to develop the image of the shroud, he ended up with the actual sort of positive image. So the shroud itself is a photographic negative. Very, very bizarre. So there's more detail that actually came up when he took a photograph and took the negative. Now, normally it's the other way around. Have you ever seen a photographic negative? Now we're in the digital era, perhaps not everybody has, but, it kind of looks ghostly and everything like that. Well, this is the other way. And I had somebody on my Facebook group page actually say, well, Jesus is not an old man, but this is the reason why most people think Jesus is the shroud image was of an old man, because they're actually seeing the photographic negative, which is actually a positive. So when the shroud image is dark, the negative image is white, which is why it looks like it's got a white beard. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, again. So, just to say it again.
Okay. Okay. So, sorry, I can go faster than that. So, on the shroud itself, you've got a pale sepia image.
Yeah.
When you take a photograph and you create a negative, you actually create a white image. Okay, so that's why people think that the shroud shows an old man, because it looks like it's got a white beard in the negative image. But this is completely unusual for any image of any sort. The paintings do not do this. Okay, so that's another really weird thing. When this came out, and this made worldwide headlines at the turn of the 20th century, people thought he'd faked it. And it was just so detailed, people thought he'd faked it. He had to wait until photography had come on and the shroud was allowed to be photographed again in the 1930s for him to be vindicated. And he was still alive at the time. Jumping to the 1970s, a couple of physicists in Los Alamos were actually looking at a photograph of the shroud, and they noticed that there was different pixel density. And they thought, well, what would happen if we put this in a VPA imager, which actually takes topological information? And what happened was, suddenly this image popped out. A three-dimensional image was encoded in the shroud. And paintings do not do this. Normal photographs do not do this. They do not have this topological density. So then they got very, very intrigued. Because it can suddenly produce a three-dimensional image. This is why we have more information, because the better our imaging gets, the more detail we're getting off the shroud. One of those physicists was this chap called John Jackson, and he persuaded the church that the shroud should be examined in 1978. Anybody know about this group? Yeah? Okay, so they were called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP for short. And they included the best physicists, chemists of the day, and a photographer called Barry Schwartz, who was Jewish and was not interested in the topic at all, but very, very soon realised that this was not what he was expecting. He thought they were going to go in, photograph the thing, do lots of analysis and get out again. He's now dedicated his life to the shroud because he realises that this is a very, very highly unusual object. Now, they had 5 days, they worked round the clock, and they did lots of analysis, the best analysis they could do at the day. And they did so much, I'm going to really summarise some of the key findings. So they found that the image behaves entirely differently, as I said, from a painting or a photo. It actually isn't a painting or a photo, it's a database of holographic information. And encoded in there is information that you can only get with the sort of instruments we have had from the 20th century onwards. From the late 20th century onwards. This did not exist. So whoever was faking this somehow managed to get the best laser that we don't even have today and encode all this encode all this information into the image, knowing someday that, the big joke is on people like about 1,000 years later who are suddenly going to see this. But so what sort of forger would do that? Really interestingly, when you actually look at the detail, things like the coins, as I said, this guy's got a little pigtail. Now, how many people sitting here know that the fashion of young men in that era, of Jewish young men, is to have a pigtail? I mean, it's not something that you think about. And it's very, very few people in the world who would actually know this, especially in medieval times when the mind does not think like that. You can see the directionality of the whipping. That's what comes out when we see this detail. There's a guy called Max Frey who did some studies. He spent years on this, and he just took sellotape and he took samples off the top. Very, very high-tech method, but he just took samples off the top of the shroud, and he analysed it. He spent years doing this, and he analysed it and found that there was pollen from various countries, and this is what he analysed as the various countries. So he looked at plants that only grow in certain areas and don't grow anywhere else. Okay, what he didn't find were plants that were now extinct. That would have been a bit of a smoking gun, but this is what he found. So he found, as to be expected, plants that grow in Europe, pollen from plants that grow in Europe, plants from the Jordan Valley, from Anatolia, so that's like Turkey and that sort of region, Istanbul, and he also found a lot of rice. Now that's quite interesting because one of the places where the shroud was shown in Italy, grows a lot of rice, so that's to be expected. So it absolutely fits the story that I'm going to be talking about later. Now he didn't know that story at the time, but these are the sort of areas that he found. So that's completely blind. So why Anatolia? Why places like Istanbul? So the forensic details that I've talked about, the thumbs, the flagrum, the blood, they've done some blood analysis. Spectral analysis, when you x-ray a painting, you can see behind it. They also showed the UV fluorescence where they found the serum that I mentioned before. You might have heard some controversy where people say, the Shroud of Turin is a fake. Walter Crone found pigments, iron pigments that mean it's paint, so therefore case closed. Has anybody heard that they found paint on it? They looked for paint, they couldn't find it, but one of the initial researchers is called Walter Crone. He still to this day says that he found paint. What he found was iron pigments. Now, so he therefore concluded that paint was used to create it. Now, some people say, a lot of people used to put their own paintings to the shroud and touch it to the shroud later on to get their paintings blessed, if you understand what I mean, yeah? Okay, does everybody follow that? So if they've done a painting of the shroud, they would go and touch it to it and get it blessed. Okay, so that's one of the explanations. Another one is that there was no nickel or any of the other elements that you find in paint. And later analysis found that there was blood. So the iron pigment, of course, could have come from the blood elements, from the heme elements of blood. Okay, because you don't find any of the other elements that are found in paint. So if you hear people talk about, Walter Crone has proved it's a painting, blah, 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 there's a bit more detail than that. Somebody actually has given me this, you won't be able to read this, but Freud actually had a case where he was put a woman under hypnosis where she'd been having recurrent dreams of the crucifixion. Put her under hypnosis, very well-spoken lady, And she started speaking in Aramaic. He didn't know it was Aramaic. He got a colleague who, I don't know how this colleague happened to be handy, happened to know Aramaic. And he also suggested to this woman under hypnosis that she speak English, and he wrote all this down. Now, what she saw, what she described, was that in the crucifixion, Jesus did not have, had a ponytail, strangely enough, and did not have the nails through his hand. He had it through the wrist, which a lot of people, even at that point, would not really have commonly known. Okay, so very, very weird. That's just an aside. Freud didn't believe it himself. He was very uncomfortable with it, and he put it aside as paranormal, not very interested. But somebody has brought that to my attention, which is another kind of interesting aside. Now, so how's this been so far? It's been sort of made you think of it? Yeah? Okay.
Are you going to tell us how it was found, or when and how it was found?
Yeah. So that's the interesting thing, because we don't have a full history of the shroud, which has led to its a lot of questioning. Okay, and I'll also go into the carbon dating, and then why I think the mechanism has got to do with black holes. Okay, so how are we doing for time? So should we go for another 20 minutes and then stop, or? Yeah. Okay. Right. So the history. Okay, as I've just said, that there is a big problem with the history, in that we don't really have much of it. So we have a history of the shroud that's undisputed, that only goes back to like 1355 in France, and that's all that we have that's undisputed. So where did it all start? Well, actually, has anybody actually read the Bible? Some people, some of it. Okay, so if you actually read John's Gospel, it actually describes that there were some shrouds up that were left in the tomb. So I'll just play this for you.
And the other disciple ran more quickly than Peter, and came first to the tomb, and stooping, sees lying the sheets. Comes therefore also Simon Peter following him, and entered the tomb, and he beholds the sheets lying, and the kerchief which was on the head of him, not with the sheets lying, but apart, having been wrapped up in one place.
Okay, so that was obviously that's an English translation, but you can see that they're talking about shrouds up. You know, not just one. There's several cloths that John's Gospel is describing, and I always say that the real miracle of Jesus is not that he was resurrected, but that he rose from the dead and then folded up all his sheets behind him. So it's like, sorry, how many men do you know would do that? No, sorry, I'm being a bit sexist here. But notice it mentions a kerchief. So the kerchief, you think of like a handkerchief, obviously a translation, actually is something that's smaller than the shroud. So we'll come back to that later. So the big problem. Oh, how did I do that? Oh, right, that's the Sudarium. So we're going to come on to the Sudarium a bit later. Anybody heard of the Sudarium before? No? Okay, yeah. Another thing that's obviously kept very, very hidden from the public. So this is the beginning. John's Gospel mentions that the beloved disciple, whoever he is, there's a lot of debate as to who he is, or even she, comes and sees that there's several linens and they're folded up in the tomb. That's the beginning. The next thing we know is it appears in about 1355, when it's put on display by by the widow of one of the most celebrated knights of France at the time, Geoffrey de Charnay. And it's in the town of Lire, and that's it. That's the next that we hear. And there doesn't seem to be anything in between. Now, I'll put this up there because anybody heard of the Holy Grail and that sort of thing? Yeah? Okay. So a lot of those stories came out from a place called, is it Troy or Troy? Troy? Or Troy? I don't know how you pronounce it in French. Is it Troy or Troy? Troyes. Is it Troy? Well, should we say Troy at the moment?
No, it isn't called that in French.
It isn't called. Should we call it Troy at the moment?
We pronounce it Troy, but it isn't.
It is, but it's Troy. Is it Troy in French?
Probably.
Right, okay. So we'll call it Troy today. Okay. It wasn't called that. So this is Lire, the B. I've got this from Google Maps, and this is Troy. So this is where all the Grail romancers came from, and it's 12 miles away. And if anybody's read Graham Hancock's books about the Ark of the Covenant, he also links the Ark of the Covenant to this area of France. So it's very interesting. So a lot of where the shroud first appears is in this very area. Very interesting, and not to a rich family either. It's actually to someone who's what we might call middle class, and he spent some time asking the King of France for some money to build a chapel. Now, he didn't specify who was building a chapel for the shroud. Everybody just assumes that. And when the chapel was actually built, the shroud was not on the list of things that were in the chapel. It was only after he died, a hero's death at the Battle of Poitiers, that his widow, presumably because she needed the money, who knows, then started to put the shroud on display. And so that's when it started to cause controversy. So, sorry, going back, is there anything that is in between? So people have said, well, it must be fake because we can only trace it to medieval history, and also the carbon dating traces it back to that time, case closed. But as I'm going to say, we might actually have some more details on that. Now, there's a guy called Ian Wilson who's based in Oxford. He's a UK scholar who's actually proposed that the cloth was actually called the mandilion before. The shroud was actually something called the mandilion. Now, the mandilion is something that we do know about. And basically, it was just a cloth with a floating head. That's all it was. And we know about the history of this thing called the mandilion. So we know about it was presented to King Abgar of Edessa, which is now Urfa in Turkey, and by the early followers of Jesus. Okay, so around 70 AD, King Abgar who'd heard about Jesus and asked him to come to cure him of leprosy. This is how the legend goes. Asked him to come. Jesus didn't come because he ended up dead. And so the followers of Jesus came to present him with a cloth. There's this story that's actually found in several places in Egypt. We've actually uncovered this story. It's quite widespread, told a lot at the time. The story is that in comes the cloth with the floating head on it, and it was all shining, and King Abgar was cured of leprosy. And so this is the mandilion. So the mandilion was presented by some of the followers of Jesus' disciples, not the direct disciple. The stories are very specific about that. It wasn't a direct disciple. And so this started a small Christian movement in Turkey at the time, in Edessa at the time, which for various reasons was actually wiped out. Ian Wilson goes into great detail about this. It's absolutely amazing how much detail he's gone into. So the image of Jesus with the forked beard started to appear around this time. Before that, around the time the mandilion was being shown, before that, Jesus was shown as a youthful, unbearded man with a cap on, and very sort of Greek image. So where do we get this image of Jesus? With the beard and everything. So the copies of the mandilion that we still have, show certain features. The forked beard and certain features. So this is a sort of floating head. This is a copy of the mandilion. And what Ian Wilson has shown is that copies of the mandilion and the artwork at the time show these certain features in common with the shroud. So the mandilion and copies of the mandilion have things like this ridge in the forehead, the forked beard, various things that, and also the eyes look one way or the other. What do we know about the shroud? There's coins over the eyes. You can't tell, where the eyes were. You wouldn't be able to tell on a dead person anyway. But so the eyes are sort of going one way or the other. So it's very, very interesting. So basically, Ian Wilson makes a case that shortly after Jesus' death. Don't forget, these are Jews. The followers of Jesus were Jews, if they did exist. And they would have found a picture of a naked body. They would have found that difficult to handle with their religion being about been about not worshipping idols. Okay, so any depiction of a god was not okay for strict Jews. So his idea is perhaps they folded it up to hide that, so it was just a floating head. Do you remember I said the neck does not appear on the shroud? So if you fold up the shroud, you just got a floating head. That was then embroidered and then presented to the king of Edessa, King Apgar, as the Manjirian, as the cure for leprosy. Okay, is everybody following this? Okay, so this is Manjirian. So what Ian Wilson is saying is that Manjirian was actually the shroud folded up, and that's where it was all this time. Okay, yeah. So I mean, he goes into great detail. I have to say now. As I said, the Christian movement in Edessa took off, and then it was thwarted for various reasons, and the Manjirian had to get hidden. It was hidden in the wall of the city, and it was discovered. So this is a picture of the Manjirian getting rediscovered again. It was rediscovered in the 6th century, and that's where it remained until it was taken to Constantinople, which at that point was the centre of Christianity in 946 AD. And that's where it remained. You've got to remember how absolutely amazing Constantinople was at the time. It had gold, it had many, many relics. It was the place for Christianity. And it was stolen amongst many other relics in the sacking of the city in 1204. Okay, so when Constantinople was taken. Now, shall we? How about? Is everybody wanting a break or? Yeah. Yeah.
Who sacked it?
That's the sad thing. It was other Christians.
Yeah.
So it was people on the Crusades actually horrifically stripped the city, and people think that the Pope allowed it because they wanted this church to come, the power to come from the east to Rome.
Yeah.
So that's it. Now, how's everybody feeling? Do you want to come back? Yeah, you feeling okay, or do you want to come back?
Pictures of Jesus from before Manjirian time. Is that in the 1st century?
You know what, I can't remember the exact date. I'll have a look at my notes and have a look when the pictures of Jesus started to change. But they started to change once the Manjirian was started to be shown around. Okay, it was, as I said, it was hidden for a while.
I didn't know there were actual records of Jesus around that time, let alone pictures.
Sorry, yeah, but this is something that people presume to be Jesus. Yeah, this is something. So the Manjirian, the case that Ian Wilson is saying is that the Manjirian was actually the shroud folded up. And so we didn't see it as a shroud, we saw it as a floating head, but actually behind it, it was the folded up full shroud, and it was framed. So that's what he's arguing the case for, and that's why he looked at all the similarities between the Manjirian copies and the shroud itself. And so we have the shroud, and we can see the similarities in the facial features and everything. Okay, so is everybody happy to go on to finish the history part? Oh, yeah? Do you want to have a break, or which one? Finish your history part. Okay, brilliant. Okay, it's only a couple more slides. Now, so where did it go after? If the Manjirian was the shroud, okay, that's if. But Ian Wilson does make quite a good case, and it is actually being taken quite seriously now. People actually do kind of accept that the Manjirian was the shroud. Where did it go from there, and where did the Knights Templars come in? So it didn't take me long to actually find quite a few links to Athens. So one of the people who rampaged through Constantinople, taking everything and nicking all the relics and things, was, I think it was either the ancestor or it was Otter de la Roche, someone called Otter de la Roche, or the ancestor of Otter de la Roche, who was at the time the ruler of Athens. Okay, so they were actually going around and taking all these relics from Constantinople, and so the Duchy of Athens, the Duke of Athens, was one of them. Okay, and now I found two sources that actually link the shroud with the Duchy of Athens. And scientifically, if you've got one source, you have to sort of go, maybe, maybe not. If you've got three sources, you have to go, maybe there's something in it. So there were records at the time of how the spoils from Constantinople were divvied up. Okay, so, and in there they mentioned that the shroud, it's called various things over the years, like Sindon and, things like that. So it's difficult to know, we're talking about the shroud, but they mentioned a shroud going to Athens. Okay, and interestingly, there's a UFO researcher in Italy who found this in Florence. Okay, and in this mural, which is in actually the main, Palazzo Vecchio, that's what I'm trying to say. Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, so it's like the main town hall. There's this mural now. It used to be in the prison for some reason, but it was moved here some time ago. And in this, you see one of the descendants of Otto de la Roche, who is called Walter de Brienne. Okay, and he came at the time. His family were the Dukes of Athens, and the Catalans took over Greece. Okay, so they were ousted from Athens. So by the time it came to Walter de Brienne, sorry, this is quite complicated family history, but they were actually no longer in Athens. So he was a Duke of Athens, but he wasn't ruling Athens. He was asked to come and rule Florence. Okay, and he ruled Florence for 18 months. He was a very, very unpopular leader. Okay, so he ended up being ousted. And when he was ousted, they created this mural, that's Saint Anne. These are some Knights Templar, I think. And it's a very, very curious mural. And by a painter called Alcania. And so what this guy noticed is this Italian researcher. He actually noticed that there's a picture, there's a cloth here that Walter de Brienne has taken out, and on there's a picture of a bearded face. And so he started to wonder if this Duke of Athens has been ousted from Florence actually had the shroud with him. And strangely, he had many, many, many soldiers when he arrived in Florence, and he's wondering, was that because he wanted to guard something? So with just one link, you haven't really got anything. But it didn't take me long to actually discover that there are some documents which link the shroud to Walter de Brienne's ancestor. So in the sacking of Constantinople, it could have been taken by Otto de la Roche, Otto de la Roche handing it to his descendants, Walter de Brienne, who had it with him for a short time in Florence. Now, who is Walter de Brienne linked to? Guess what? Jeanne de Vergy and Geoffrey de Charny, who are the couple who appear with the shroud in France later on. There's strong links to both of them. And depends, in this room, of course, we talk about bloodline being a certain thing. We talk about the bloodline families and things. There's also another meaning of bloodline, this sort of bloodline that Da Vinci Codes talks about, which are, supposedly descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Now, interestingly, were all these families linked through that link, perhaps? I don't know. But interestingly, Geoffrey, before he died, founded an order of Our Lady of Noble Lineage. Mary Magdalene, perhaps? I don't know. So, so very quickly, I found several links to say that after Constantinople, the shroud could have gone to this family and could have gone to Athens. Okay, so, strangely enough, this is just me Googling around. There's actually a Hungarian artist who was creating a stamp in 1999, and he uncovered a picture by an artist in Florence called Masaccio. And he couldn't believe it, because when he compared it to the shroud, the proportions are absolutely identical. And so how would he have got it absolutely so right? Maybe in Florence, Masaccio had a copy of the shroud from when it was in Florence. So there's a link to Athens, Florence, France. So we could actually have filled in the history of the shroud. That first of all, it was a Mandylion, and then it came to Constantinople. Then when the sacking of Constantinople, it was taken to Athens briefly, where the Duchy of Athens had hold of it. they gave it to Brienne, who took it to Florence. When he was ousted from Florence, he gave it to the family that he had a lot of connections with, who appeared with it in France. All the families are connected, and there is evidence for all of this.
Actually, another thing with the Knights Templar, wasn't also their downfall where they were accused of worshipping a severed head called the provenance?
Yes, exactly. And this is hugely controversial. I've got the Knights Templar here, and Ian Wilson makes a case for perhaps the severed head was the Manjirian, but some people are very, very much disputing his sources. So it's kind of not very clear what that is. But Barbara Frale, who is a Vatican researcher of all people, has written a book on this, and she believes that that's exactly what was going on. And interestingly, the name is Geoffrey de Charnay, the person whose family appeared with the Shroud in 1355. He's got exactly the same name, but nobody's been able to create a link with the guy that was killed with Jacques de Molay, with one of the last Knights Templar. Whether they were connected or not, I don't know, but definitely some people. The Knights Templar have got to come up in there somewhere. I mean, they get blamed for everything. So, so whether or not the Knights Templar had it. So, as I said, after Geoffrey's death at the Battle of Poitiers, Jean, his widow, displayed the shroud in the Church of Liray. The Bishop of Troyes, we're saying Troyes today, protested, saying it was a fake immediately. And interestingly, the Pope told him to shut up. So something very odd was going on. Eventually, Margaret de Charnay, the granddaughter of Geoffrey de Charnay, gave the shroud to the Savoy family in 1453, and they had it ever since. So they had a fire in 1532, where it got quite badly damaged. There was silver that was dropped on there, all sorts of things. It came to Turin in 1578, and eventually it was given to the church by the Savoy family in 1983. So they had it for as long as that. So in all that time, they were showing it around Italy and various places. So just to let you know that there is something that exists called the Pray manuscript that can be dated to 1190. And on here, it's sort of showing the burial happening, and it's based in Hungary. And you can see the sort of weave. Can you note the 3-to-1 herringbone weave on there? And the L-shaped marks, which people think were created by red-hot pokers, maybe, saying that whether or not this is a fake. So, okay, but that's the history. So it just goes to show that we actually have something that exists, showing the shroud that's dated to 1190, so it's dated before the first exposition in France. So we'll have a break now, yeah? And I'm giving you a lot of information.
They're not going to move. We'll take 20 minutes or so. Manjir.
Yeah? Okay, thank you. And thank you for your feedback during the break. It's good to know that this is a topic that is interesting for people. I just do this stuff and put it out in the world. I don't know if it's going to be interesting to people. So before the break, we were talking about the history of the shroud and how we could be in a position where we may start to fill in some of the gaps. And as I said, I am looking at this scientifically. So if we have one source, that's one thing. But if we have several sources pointing to the same story, that's something that you have to take a bit more seriously. So we might have this story that everyone says about the shroud that, oh, well, we haven't got any history of it, it must be a fake, blah, blah, blah. But if you start to fill in the gaps, then that argument might go away. I want to talk to you about another aspect of the shroud that not that many people talk about, because is anybody Jewish in this room? Just Jewish background? Okay. Can you just enlighten us as to,
Definitely not.
maybe what the normal philosophy is for a Jewish burial at all?
No, I wasn't brought up a religious.
You weren't brought up
totally
with
secular, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I just know they like to be buried straight away.
Yes, yeah. I mean, having worked as a doctor in the East End of London and come across many different religious backgrounds. And I did find that when somebody does pass away, there's very particular Jewish customs that are done.
But you have to sit shiva with them the first night.
Right.
I know that. And I think the Orthodox Jews would like to be buried pretty much the next day.
Yes, yeah. That seems to be one of the signatures of Jewish burials, that according to Judaism and most eras, they like to bury the body pretty much immediately. So it's a very quick burial. What most people don't comment on is the very curious Jewish burial that is described as happening to Jesus in the Gospels. Because if you note, they don't bury him straight away. They lay him out with a shroud on him in a tomb. Okay, they talk about bringing him down. By the way, the Gospels are not consistent as to when he was crucified. There's lots of inconsistencies in the Gospels. So I'm not going to say they took him down before the Passover, because one Gospel says that and another Gospel doesn't. Have a look, they actually differ. So they're not very reliable. But, the general story that people take from the Gospels is that he was taken down very quickly from the cross and laid in a tomb. And the tomb had a sort of round stone over the entrance. And the next day, Mary Magdalene and her companions came along and to anoint the body. Yeah? So, is this ringing a bell with everybody? Mm-hmm. Now, what people don't realise is that is not a normal Jewish practice. Okay? That particular Jewish practice only happened for a very, very short period of time in Jerusalem, from about 30 BC to 70 AD, when the sacking of Jerusalem happened by the Romans. Okay, so it's not something that, so the very fact that this practice is described in the Bible is another reason why we've got to think again as whether or not it's authentic, because that is not normal Jewish practice. It only happened for that particular group of people at that particular time. Only the elite Jews who could afford a family tomb. And we know, the Gospel says some mysterious person called Joseph of Arimathea provided the tomb. Only the rich people were able to. Is everybody okay with? Can see it? Okay. Were able to have this burial. So the tombs looked a bit like this. I actually saw this in another one of my visions, would you believe it? So they have very particular ideas. They thought that the end was nigh. And they thought what was going to happen was they would be all resurrected and that they would need their physical bones. So what they would do is they would lay out the body for a year, anointed with lots of myrrh and aloes and scented oils and things like that, so that the body wouldn't smell. And after a year, when the body had decomposed, the family would then gather and do a reburial and put the bones into a box called an ossuary. And we know that this is the case because we actually are finding these ossuaries all over Jerusalem now. When people are building in Jerusalem, since about the 1970s, there's lots of building going on. People are finding ossuaries, these bone boxes, these family tombs all over Jerusalem. So we know that this particular practice went on. It was a particular time set, and it's interesting how the description is there in the Bible, and it matches the archaeological evidence. So if Jesus did exist, and the description in the Gospels actually matches what we know Jews did at that particular time, and they didn't do it at any other time. Very, very interesting. It's only in that 100-year period. So they had this particular practice of ossuaries. The head was laid on a stone pillow. Now that's also interesting because the shroud actually shows a bit of a distortion in the head, which has only come about through three-dimensional imaging, modern three-dimensional imaging. And it can only be reconciled if the head was slightly tipped, as if it was on a stone pillow. Very, very interesting. But Yeah, so this is actually a diagram of a tomb that was found where the body was actually left and not actually put into a bone box because the person had TB. So they actually found the body sort of laid out, well, obviously be bones by this time, but laid out with a shroud on them. So this is one of the few examples we have where the reburial didn't actually take place. And there's all these sorts of cubby holes, and the family would take these cubby holes and put various members of their family. Sometimes they would decorate the ossuaries, sometimes they wouldn't. Don't know if you've heard about the Jesus family tomb, that's a whole other topic that I'll go into, but some people have thought that they have actually found the very tomb of Jesus, but anyway, there's a whole other topic. But it was very similar to this. They've got these cubby holes in the side, and sometimes they would put the family themselves, just to identify for their own purposes, they would scratch on the side the name of the person that was in there, just for their own purpose. Sometimes they wouldn't. And so, I don't know if you've heard of the James ossuary that caused lots of controversy. Well, we just in the last week or so have found out that the James ossuary was not forged, even though the Israeli Antiquities Authority arrested the guy who owned it, and he's actually been released as not having forged it. So we know that the James ossuary was not forged. Whether or not it was James, brother of the Jesus, we don't know. If anybody doesn't know about this, that there was a ossuary that came to the attention of the world that actually had on the side James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, and it caused huge furore about 2002. It was announced as a fake. The guy who owned it was arrested, and the trial for his suspicion of forgery went on for about 4 years, and the verdict has only just come out in the last week that he didn't forge it. Okay, so whether it was the Jesus, whether it was the James, we don't know. But it's very interesting that what the shroud tells us is a story that can only happen at this particular time to these particular people. Because at other times Jewish burials did not happen like this. It's another really, really strong sort of thing towards the authenticity. Whether it's authentic, I'm not saying it's authentic or not. I'm saying it's more evidence towards authenticity. And this is the sort of thing that you find all around. You remember the Gospels say there was a round stone that they had to move aside. When the ladies came the next day, they were surprised to find that there was a big round stone was actually moved because it's quite heavy. Well, this is what they're describing. We find these things archaeologically in Jerusalem from that particular time. This is really, where the sort of description of the gospel actually comes from. This is actually what they were doing. So again, it fits that particular moment in time and no other. That the gospel's description, the round stone over the entrance. Also, people have often been wondering about the shroud, why it is that the body, as I said, obviously was not washed. Why it is that because often the body was washed, and the Gospels actually describe that the body was washed, but there was also a belief that the soul, the Jews at the time believed, I don't know if they still do, somebody might enlighten us, but they believed that the soul was in the blood. So if you got rid of the blood, you got rid of the soul. So they would preserve the blood on the body as much as they could, and they've actually found there was a burial where women were actually buried if they had postpartum hemorrhage, they would not be washed. So they found evidence of that as well. So there was this belief that if the person was bleeding at the time of death, you wouldn't wash the blood off. So that's something that would actually fit with some of the beliefs at the time as well. And the herbs probably stopped the smell. As there's a short film just describing these practices from actually the documentary about the James ossuary, which is why they're talking about that.
People believed that the day of judgment was imminent, and that on that day the dead would be physically resurrected. To get ready for this event, the Jews of Jerusalem began using ossuaries, literally bone boxes. This burial custom involved a two-step process. First, the deceased was brought into a cave. They would lay his body in a cool tomb on a stone slab and allow the flesh to desiccate. Now, what does this tell us, for example, about the burial of Jesus? Well, that's where that story is going. He's going to be laid out on a slab on a stone in a cool tomb. Slowly his body will decay, and eventually they will collect the bones and put it in an ossuary. So Jesus was destined for an ossuary, only things got interrupted in the process.
A year after James's burial, when his flesh had decomposed, James's family would have gathered his bones and lovingly put them into an ossuary so that he would be ready for Judgment Day. It would be 2,000 years before an ossuary surfaces that at least one expert believes belonged to James.
Okay, so that's just a short film about a description of how these burials were done. Again, it's absolutely unique to the time. And that's a description we find in the Gospels, and that's also where whoever it was in the shroud was headed. So, because normally Jewish burials happen straight away, there's no need for that shroud, and there's no need to lay them out for a year. But it's because of their particular beliefs at the time. Some of the side beliefs, we were talking about the Knights Templar earlier. If you do look into the Jesus family tomb, there's an interesting little thing. A tomb was found which has lots of the names etched on the ossuaries which match the Jesus family. Mariamne, written in a sort of Greek form, which is a name that we know Mary Magdalene went under in some of the Gospels. Maria, which is the Latinized form of Mary, which is what we know that Jesus' mother was called. There was Judah, name of his brother, Joseph, name of his brother, and the James ossuary probably came from the patina, which is the covering actually matches, and there was also a Jesus, son of Joseph. And there was also, interestingly, a Judas, son of Jesus. So there's all of these, Matthew, which is all names associated with Jesus' family, whether you believe it or not. But interestingly, when the burial was found, because an ossuary, if you think about it, it fits in the bone box the best if the long bones are put in a cross, the femurs, and the skull is put on top. Now, and totally unusually, totally uniquely for a tomb that's been found, they found on the floor when they opened this tomb two bones on the floor, 3 sets of bones with the femurs and the skull on the top. Now, there's this theory going out, just as an aside, that somehow the Knights Templar, when they were in Jerusalem, actually found this tomb, buried their leaders in there at the time, and that became the pirate symbol, the skull and crossbones. So when the Knights Templar then became the pirates, they used that symbol, and that comes from the ossuaries, which is the femurs crossed and the skull on top. So that's the theory of a journalist called Simka Jakubowicz, who's been working with James Cameron to make these documentaries. They're interesting. Go have a look, make up your own mind about the Jesus family tomb. Okay, so that's the particular burial practices which are peculiar to this point in time. I want to just move on to something called Sudarium. Now, everybody said at the beginning that they had not heard of the Sudarium. Not surprisingly, because the Sudarium isn't something that's been discussed. Now, in history, if you look back, of course, there were a lot of fake shrouds. There were a lot of fake relics. Everybody had the finger of Mary Magdalene, everybody had John the Baptist's head, everybody had... But the Shroud of Turin that we talk about has always been pretty unique. There was also another shroud that was also seen to be authentic, that had bloodstains on it. It was quite a large cloth. It was actually destroyed in the French Revolution. We don't have that shroud anymore. So we know about actually 3 shrouds. Do you remember the Gospel of John talked about the kerchief? Well, we think we have the kerchief. Now, unlike the Shroud of Turin, nobody really knows about it. It's kept absolutely quiet. And it's only just been studied in the last 10 years. And people are now starting to make pilgrimages. And we're actually coming up to Easter. Anybody fancy popping across to Spain and seeing it? Because it's brought out in Easter. So that's when you can see it. In this northern town of Spain called Oviedo. And so sometimes called the Shroud of Oviedo. Now, if you actually visit Oviedo, There's no sign saying Sudarium is here. And Sudarium is a word that can mean something that's like a smaller cloth. Okay, so people basically think it was the head cloth that was wrapped around the body of a person who's crucified, in order to, remember I said the blood was thought of as sacred and the soul was in the blood, to contain the blood and also cover the face of a dead person. So that's what the Sudarium was used for. So the Sudarium is kept in this place called Oviedo. Very little known about, as I said. Even if you visit the actual church that it is, you probably will not be told about it. Very much kept secret. The important thing about the Sudarium, though, is we know where it has been since the 6th century. We know exactly where it's been. And it was arrived in Spain in a chest, a silver chest, along with a number of other relics. And records of the Sudarium have been kept for many, many centuries. We know of its provenance. Unlike the Shroud, which I said the history is, quite sketchy. We may be able to fill it in, as I said now, but with the Sudarium, we actually know where it's been. Now, as I said, this is the sort of scenario that we're thinking happened with the Sudarium, and it has been forensically and scientifically studied in the last 10 years. Spanish scientists have formed a group, and they studied. There's 2 books that are out in English. There's I can't remember the name of there's a guy called Mark Guskin, and there's another called I think it's called Sacred Blood, Sacred Image. I'm not sure of the name, I'll find it out. So Sudarium is a much smaller cloth. It's a much simpler cloth, and there's no image on it. And the recent forensic examination has been published, so this is kind of what it looks like. It looks like a bit of a mess, really, but it's got a double image because it was folded back on itself. So, and it's actually got these small puncture wounds all over it as well. Crown of thorns, who knows, but I mean it's got these small puncture wounds. And again, like the Shroud, it's got this large puncture wound. So whether or not in times gone by people were actually testing these out with hot pokers, who knows, to see if it's authentic or not. But it has the same blood type as the Shroud of Turin, type AB, which is quite common in that area, not as common in Europe. The blood stains on the Sudarium match the Shroud exactly. So when you actually do the scientific analysis, and I'll show you what that looks like, it actually matches the Shroud exactly. And remember, we've known where the Sudarium is for the last few hundred years, so since the 6th century. It's got these puncture marks. The journey of the body can actually be reconstructed. So we know that this was wrapped around somebody whose head was to the side, who had rigor mortis. They couldn't move the head, so they wrapped it back around itself, which is where you get the double image. Somebody has put their hand on the actual nose to stop the fluids from coming out. You can see the finger marks. The person was actually then laid down. The corpse was actually laid down for a while. And it's interesting because, I don't know if you, if you read the Gospel, there's quite a bit of toing and froing to Pontius Pilate as to whether the body of Jesus could be released. Whether this was this period, who knows? But we can reconstruct the story of this Sudarium from that.
Modern investigative techniques permit the bloodstains on the Sudarium to be superimposed over those on the Shroud. The result is astonishing.
The stains coincide in the 3 main things. First of all, the blood group, AB. Second, stains corresponding to the back of the head are blood that was shed in life. There are many little stains that were caused by some kind of sharp object that had penetrated the skin. By overlaying images of the 2 cloths, the blood stains, the actual shape of the stains, does coincide, which leads to another medical conclusion. These 2 cloths were used on the same corpse. It's a purely scientific conclusion. Now, if it covered the same corpse as the Shroud of Turin, well, obviously the Shroud is at least as old as the Sudarium.
But setting aside the obvious similarities, there is one very important difference. Unlike the history of the Shroud,
The history of the Sudarium is undisputed.
Okay, so you didn't know about it until this evening? Well, it's a pretty important artifact, and it could actually be what leads us to authenticating the shroud. So the Sudarium goes back to the 6th century, you know all about it. It's the same cloth that covered whoever is on the shroud. So the shroud, are you agreeing now? You're seeing there's a lot more to the shroud than is told to you?
The same fabric.
It's not the same fabric. It's a much simpler cloth. Much simpler. The linen of the shroud is a very expensive cloth that was probably imported. It's not the same fabric. I'm not sure that it was cotton, but it was a lot rougher. So it's just that if you think of the Sudarium as just keeping it and keeping the blood contained until you can get somebody to the tomb, that's the sort of thing that you're talking about. Sorry.
That's right. Has it been DNA tested to find out whether it's
Sorry, I didn't hear what you
said. Has it been DNA tested?
Right, that's exactly what I was going to say. They've actually, obviously, paleo DNA testing is actually quite difficult, but they've actually extracted mitochondrial DNA from, not from the Shroud of Turin, they've not done that yet, but they've done that from the Sudarium. Okay, so they've tested the blood and now, interestingly, and this is a total exclusive here, remember I was talking about the Jesus family tomb that Simka Jakubowicz and James Cameron. Okay, I haven't told anybody in the world this yet, but basically we have the means right now as we sit in the world to actually prove that Jesus, perhaps prove if Jesus existed or not, because they managed to get some mitochondrial DNA from the ossuary that said James, son of Joseph. Now, if that really is the Jesus tomb, and the mitochondrial DNA matches the mitochondrial DNA on the Sudarium, then, and you've got an exact match, then you could have proved that Jesus actually existed. It'd be you could go towards a proof.
Sorry, it just proves that somebody existed. How do you know this?
Yeah, it could prove that somebody existed. But if you've got two things that are related to it, it could go towards a proof. Is that not absolute proof? But you've got something that could actually put a lot. Well, if it doesn't match, you haven't proved anything.
Even if it does, you haven't.
But even if it does, you've got something that, absolutely, it's not an absolute proof, but I mean, you've got something really, really going towards it. So if you've got a tomb that says it, if you've got the Sudarium, you could actually say there's a strong argument that he does. I mean, unless you've got, the whole thing together, you're absolutely right, but...
The point being, unless you have a reference biological sample from Jesus Christ, all this proves is that it was a shroud.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, you're proving that the same person, basically, yeah, you're right. So what you're proving is the same person who is in the James, son of Joseph, tomb, with all the family around him, all his family around him, whoever that James, son of Joseph, had that Sudarium on his face. Right, okay, yeah, that's good. So, yeah, you're right. So, you can actually say that, but with the fact that you've got Mariamne and all that, there's quite a strong case. And but it's not absolutely undisputed, of course. Right, okay, so where does that leave the carbon dating? Because a lot of people, like myself, just have assumed that the Shroud of Turin was proved a fake, end of story, forget about it, it's not important. I thought that right at the beginning. So, just to show you what happened at the carbon dating, I mean, there's a whole book called The Jesus Conspiracy. Of course, there has to be a book called The Jesus Conspiracy about how the carbon dating were, and if you actually read, excuse me, what happened at the time, you see all of the protocol that the church and the scientists planned in the 80s when they were doing this carbon dating, it was actually just went out the window. And so the samples that were taken for the carbon dating, this is something called a raised fragment. Okay, this was taken in the 70s. Was taken, these are all the labs, Arizona, Zurich, Oxford, took 2 samples, and 1 was retained. These are all the labs that took a sample for carbon dating, so the idea was that they would all be independent and wouldn't confer. Last minute, they couldn't decide where to take the sample from. And they took it from the far corner, where a sample had already been taken, which, if they had actually looked at the UV fluorescence pictures, would have realised that UV fluorescence is completely different to the rest of the shroud. The UV fluorescence pictures were taken in the 1970s, and they showed that there was something very different about that area. Okay, so they took it from there. So they were supposed to take different bits from different areas so that you'd have a control. But they didn't. They all ended up effectively taking one sample. This was a last-minute decision. They completely broke protocol, and and they couldn't decide where to take it. It's a bit of a farce, really. Everybody sort of deciding last minute. So one piece really was cut into four. There was no control, and it was revealed later that all the labs were supposed to not talk to each other, but they all did. So they all broke protocol. So there was a lot going on with that didn't fit. And here was a very famous picture of the announcement that the shroud was dated between 1260 and 1390. So, of course, that fits when the shroud first appeared in Liry and France in around 1355. So people thought, right, medieval fake, case closed, and that's what most people think. Now that, of course, it's all, unless you look into the science like we have done today and see, how on earth is somebody going to fake that? You know, I'm not saying that it is authentic or it is a forgery, but you end up with thinking that it's a lot deeper than this. So this guy is, I can't remember his surname, Teddy. He's absolutely adamant that this is the end of the story, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of the shroud sort of believers, as it were absolutely flabbergasted because all of the data before that showed there was something more going on. But when the carbon dating came out, all of that was ignored. When it comes to the public, they pretty much think case closed and don't look into it anymore, but there's a lot more going on. So what's wrong with it? Suddenly, there was a lady in the early, I think the late 1990s, who was called Sue Benford. She actually just passed away about a couple of years ago. And she was a nurse in the USA. And she started out of nowhere having all of these mystical transmissions. Like, so basically, someone who called himself John, I don't know how many people here are psychic or have anything, or a channel or anything like that, or yeah, a few people. So it's not completely out of kilter with this group. Sorry?
By no means.
By no means, brilliant. So, okay, to a lot of people, obviously, this is completely bizarre. But for her, she'd never had anything like this before. She started to, and she's written a book about it. It's called Strong Woman, Unraveling the Secrets of the Shroud. She was born with a severe illness, which made her very weak. And she ended up being the reason why it's called Strong Woman is she ended up overcoming this and becoming a weightlifting champion. That's what I'm trying to say. But eventually this illness, I think, did kill her, so she ended up passing away 2 years ago, as I said. But not before she had gained a partner in this research, which is actually an ex-priest called Joe Marino, who, after she told him all the story about John, like people like John talking to her and giving all of this information, left the priesthood and actually joined her in the search. Now, she started to get mystical transmissions that the shroud, the carbon dating was not right. So she went off on her own theory and thought there was something to do with neutrinos, this and that, this and that. And then she started to get the mystical transmission that, no, the shroud has been mended. And she went, oh, no, because she'd gone down all this path, she was just about to publish, and then suddenly she gets this channeling, and it's like, no, the shroud's been mended. So she went, oh, all right then. So it's interesting because it didn't come from her conscious mind. That's the interesting thing. She was a scientifically trained person, and she was going down one route, and so when she looked at it, she saw a distinct break in the weave, and she sent it to textile experts in a blind study, and they all came back and said this is a sophisticated way of interweaving cotton into linen that was done by it must have been commissioned by a wealthy family, Savoy family, hello, and in Europe in the 16th century. This is the sort of thing that they did. And textile experts could actually see that that was what was going on. They didn't know what they were looking at, which you could argue is a bit difficult because a 3-to-1 herringbone weave is a bit of a giveaway. But, it was supposed to be a blind study. So, and also the cotton had been dyed to make it look more like the linen. So they could pick that up straight away. So just from the photographs. So that was very interesting, and this is Sue Benford here. Now, so I'm just going to play a little film of what Sue and Joe did after that.
Benford and Marino argued that because the carbon dating sample contained material from both the 16th and 1st centuries, the result was in between the two. Searching for definitive proof, Benford took a closer look at the carbon dating results to see if there was anything odd about the data at the 3 different test centres. And hidden in the numbers, she found evidence that some parts of the test sample contained more 16th century cotton.
If you look at their unpublished data now, Arizona had some of the oldest dates at 1238 and the youngest at 1430. And you think, were they really 200 years off in their lab? Well, perhaps it's because of material they took from both of their different sites. Now, we don't know that for sure, and they haven't confirmed that. But that's interesting. Oxford is the next oldest, and they're the closest to this side with the most main 1st century material. Zurich is in the middle, and guess what? They have the middle amount, and they have the middle dates.
Okay, so they actually published this data, and this chap here, whose name is Ray Rogers again, he's just passed away in the last few years, but he was one of the original chemists who was working on the Sturp group in 1978, and he immediately said, this is absolute nonsense. This is the left-wing loonies, whatever, you know, and this is the lunatic fringe, you call them. And he was on the phone to Barry Schwartz, remember the guy who was a photographer at the Sturp group? And he said, I can prove them wrong in just a few seconds. I have part of the raised fragment, I can take it out, or part of the actual original fragment, I can take it out, look in the microscope, prove them wrong immediately. So Barry Schwartz said to him, well, why don't you? So he said, okay, right. So he got out the fragment and really believing he was going to prove them wrong, and this is what he found. He found that cotton and linen had indeed been woven together, very, very tightly, very, very sophisticated way, but and that was the area that the carbon dating was taken. Okay, so he went on, as I said, he passed away shortly after that, but he went on to publish this in the last 2 years in a peer-reviewed journal. That the carbon dating is wrong. So it's been in a scientific journal now. You know, people now are realising that the carbon dating was wrong. According to science, it's passed all the tests to actually go into a scientific journal. So he also realised that the cotton had been dyed. I just got
the authentic radiocarbon sample that I got, these segments of yarn were cut from the middle of the radiocarbon sample, so there's no question about them. And when I looked at these samples from the radiocarbon area, there's no problem at all finding cotton in them.
Rogers was now convinced that Benford and Marino were right. And he found other evidence they had missed. He knew from his own tests in 1978 that the shroud was free of artificial dyes and pigments. And yet, when he looked at surviving threads from the carbon dating samples, that's exactly what he found.
You've got photomicrographs that demonstrate this very clearly. The cotton fibers from the radiocarbon sample are fairly heavily coated with the gum dye mordant, and some of the linen fibers don't show any of that at all. They look just as slick as anything, and it didn't stick to them.
He believed the dye was used to make the cotton repair invisible to the naked eye.
If you happen to hit a place where a yarn segment from the original shroud was spliced into the new reweave part, the splice very definitely shows the new yarn that was being put in and dyed to match.
Okay, so has that surprised anybody? Yeah.
I think I
Okay.
might have heard it.
You've heard it before.
I think I've heard about it, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we're now at 10:30. So we started about 10 minutes late. Is everybody okay if we go on for another 10 minutes? Yeah. Okay. So what's all this got to do with black holes? Not mentioned them at all yet. So we've gone through all the aspects of the shroud and the science and the history and everything, and so also how the carbon dating has now, I mean, this is not me saying this is in peer-reviewed journals written by the people who've actually studied the shroud itself for the last 30 years. And so what is the mechanism? So we have this object that seems to be perhaps authentic. We seem to be dating it back as far as the Sudarium at least. The cloth comes from that area. Oh, by the way, the pollen, do you remember the pollen showed Turkey and well, that's all the places the Mandylion was. You know, so even somebody who hadn't heard the Mandylion theory, Max Frey, he looked at the pollen, he ended up getting pollen to show that it had been in the areas the Mandylion was. So that's quite a strong hypothesis towards this. So what is the mechanism? How was this thing created? So some people, I don't know if you've heard of Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, they've talked about Leonardo da Vinci creating this, yeah, with the camera obscura. So Leonardo da Vinci created the shroud. That's the idea that it was a self-portrait. The camera obscura, the camera photography was not invented at the time of Leonardo da Vinci. And people say, well, you know, it's Leonardo da Vinci, he was a genius, he could have done anything. People have tried doing this. You have to keep a dummy absolutely still and you do not get a very good image. You know, people have tried to reproduce this. So that's one mechanism. And how would you get a three-dimensional image? You know, so the shroud has a lot of holographic imagery contained. I haven't gone into all that. And also the Pray manuscript is quite strong evidence, and the Sudarium, that the shroud was actually older than that. We've gone into all the... People think it's a medieval painting. Well, it doesn't move with water. It's been doused with water to put out the fire in the 16th century. There's no paint. It's too fine for a painting. You can't actually see it close up. So somebody who was working on it could not actually see what they were doing. There's absolute forensic details as we've gone through. And the person's naked. Now, in medieval art, that would be absolutely not the thing to do, you know, put a naked man on a piece of art. Would somebody really crucify somebody to create a forgery? I mean, maybe that's possible, but I mean, that's what it would involve, to know absolute forensic details about Roman crucifixion and then do this to create this. So there's also details only visible to 20th and 21st century science. So somebody back in medieval times, if they were to forge this, would have to know in the future what sort of techniques we were going to use. People, do you know what a bas-relief is? Making a sort of image and then putting a cloth on, painting it, and then taking it off. When people have tried to do that, the image has ended up extremely distorted, which is not what we found on the shroud. Somebody said sweat over there. There's also the theory that Jesus didn't die, and he actually was sweating so much, and because in the Gospels they say how much aloe they're bringing into the tomb, and it's like tons. If you actually see what they're saying, is it tons and tons and tons of aloe. So the theory there is Jesus didn't die. He was getting hot and sweaty, and they put aloe on the body in order to heal the wounds. Yes, sorry.
If they're putting on herbs or whatever on the body, isn't that going to smudge all the blood everywhere?
Exactly.
So wouldn't they really maybe they put the herbs and oils and stuff actually on the shroud and then put it on the body, especially if they had a religious belief?
They could have done, and they could have done, but the amount of aloe...
wouldn't get rid of the blood then.
Exactly. It's hard to say.
It could be the chemical reaction.
We do, yes, people have said it's a chemical reaction of the aloe with the sweat, and people have tried to reproduce this and they get a kind of image.
But maybe there was something different than aloe being used.
They found aloe on the shroud.
Oh,
so
right.
they actually have found aloe on the shroud. So it's an interesting, because I mean, why would they put that on if they didn't actually wash the body? There's other people who've said, could it be radiation? And at Hiroshima, when the bomb went off at Hiroshima, images did appear of things very sort of on say a tree got blasted or something, the image of the tree would appear maybe on a wall. So people have actually talked about gamma radiation being the cause of the shroud. So I got very, very interested. Obviously, I talk a lot about black holes. And one particular lady, a physicist, who'd actually analysed where the image had come from. So I'll just let her speak.
When you look at the image of the shroud, the two bodies next to each other, you feel that it's a flat image. But if you create, for instance, a three-dimensional object, as I did, the real body, then you realize that there is a strange dividing element, an interface, from which the image is projected up and the image is projected down. The muscles of the body are absolutely not crushed against the stone of the tomb. They are perfect. It means that the body is hovering between the two sides of the shroud. What does that mean? That there is absolutely no gravity.
Okay, so this Dame Isabel is a particle physicist who's analysed that the two images have come up and come down. There's nothing for the side of the body, and the person must have been hovering in anti-gravity. Now, at that, I really, really perked up, because you probably know I discuss a lot about black holes. And I know I'm going to go into a whole new theory of physics in about 10 minutes, but is everybody okay to go to for another 10 minutes? Is it okay? Yeah? Okay, so, and black holes, as I've been saying for the last few years, 10 years, are not the great guzzling monsters that we have known about. And black holes are sort of found all over the cosmos. So in the last few years or so, we've had all these telescopes go out in the cosmos, and we've actually seen black holes at the centre of every single galaxy. So they're starting to find them absolutely everywhere. And what they find, and this is the people who bought punk science, this is what this book is all about. What they're finding is that out of black holes are coming electrons, almost at the speed of light, positrons, which are antimatter, and gamma ray bursts are coming out of black holes. So what I've been doing for the past 10 years is speak about something called the black hole principle, where I say that everything is, at every single level, is going to the same pattern. And that is, you have infinite light coming from the black hole, spiraling through the dimensions, getting to the speed of light, which is our dimension, the limitation of our dimension, which I call the perception horizon, because it's not the limitation of the universe, but it's actually limitations of our perception. And all this stuff is what we call dark energy and dark matter. Okay, so this is a big subject in about a few minutes, and at the edge of this perception horizon, you get the photon of light that's come all this way, splitting into the electron and the positron. So that's splitting into two. And so what I call the perception horizon is the higher dimensions, and below the perception horizon. So this is what's happening at the end of this edge of a black hole. You get the photon going into an antimatter and a matter and going back again. Somebody was talking about the zero-point field. Who was talking about zero-point field? Oh yes, yeah. So this is actually what the true zero-point field is. It's the fractal black holes at every single level. Now, interestingly, the signature of this, when you look out into the cosmos, are bipolar jets. These two jets coming out. Okay. So you see this coming out of all these galaxies. You see them coming out of stars. This is our own galaxy. You see these gamma ray bursts. Okay, this is a very complex subject in about 2 seconds. But basically, the black hole principle, what I've been talking about for the 10 years, this is in our Earth's upper atmosphere. The same pattern happening. Gamma ray bursts, electrons. The electrons we call lightning, by the way. So, in thunderstorms, you get gamma ray bursts in the Earth's upper atmosphere, lightning comes out of it. You see the same pattern. Electrons, almost at the speed of light, positrons, which are the antimatter, and sometimes you see the gamma ray burst. So the whole universe is made up of fractal black holes, and at the edge of a black hole, you get the breathing process of sometimes the light going into the positron and electron, and sometimes going into the gamma ray burst, and that's what we see. And if you want to see all the references for this, because obviously I've got a lot of material on this, do look at Punk Science and do look at the material that I've got out on the internet already. Chakras again, because this is the principle that goes all the way through. Chakras are the creative black holes of the body. So this is where the body is created. Atoms again, we were talking about this, weren't we? The electron jumps. So matter and antimatter. Atoms again. What do we see in radioactivity? We see a gamma ray, alpha particle, nucleus, electrons coming out. So this process is going on everywhere. The infinite light comes out, and this is what we see: the photon going into the antimatter and the matter, and then back again into the photon. So what does this mean for our shroud? Well, I think you've guessed it already. Because what we're seeing, I believe, of course this is my theory, that what we're seeing, if we're seeing the black hole principle, and I have built up evidence over the last 10 years that this happens at every single level of the universe, I think that what happens in the shroud is a black hole moment. So we see bipolar jets at every single level of the universe. I think the body of whoever this is, if it was Jesus, erupted into a bipolar jet. The matter and the antimatter collided and formed light in the form of a gamma ray burst, of a single gamma ray burst, held the body in anti-gravity and actually created this image. And that gamma ray then made the linen fibers age. So that I believe that this might be, because the same process goes on in every level of the universe, I believe this might be what's happening in the shroud. This might have been the moment of resurrection, possibly. So, and also the antimatter is a region of anti-gravity. So it could have been a time when antimatter is stronger than the matter. So it could have been a time when the antimatter predominated, and you have this time of anti-gravity. I also think that what might be happening, the true meaning of Christianity, is this might have been what kickstarted. Has anybody heard of the sort of 26,000 year cycle, the cycle of the ages, the great year?
It's on the Zeitgeist.
On the Zeitgeist, right, brilliant. So what might have happened is, this is just my speculation now, is the true meaning of Christianity is it might be this resurrection moment, could have been the kick-starting back from the Dark Ages back to a Golden Age. This is and 2012 is a pivotal time in this year. So if you read the Gnostic Gospels, Jesus, whoever the character of Jesus is, and if the Gnostic Gospels are to be believed, Jesus described coming from a realm of Barbelo. So this is a sort of great mother, kind of realm of consciousness. Coming through the dimensions, he had a very specific mission. He knew what he was doing. I'm just wondering if by being in body, actually incarnating in body, dying and going through the bipolar jet, the black hole emission, and the resurrection process, cycling back his matter and antimatter into the gamma ray radiation, he actually sent out information into the universe, which kick-started us into the Golden Age. Okay, this is speculation, but I'm putting together all the science that I've been actually looked at for the last 10 years. The message has become very distorted, and that Jesus is saving our sins. So everybody's going to feel bad about themselves and look at a tortured body. So in summary, I would say science suggests that this is a shroud of a crucified man. The carbon dating has now been invalidated by a peer-reviewed journal. According to a court of law, this is Jesus on the shroud. Scientifically, you may argue that that's different, but lawyers would say that this was Jesus. The missing history might be filled in, so the Magdalene, Athens and Florence, as I've discovered, it may be. The Sudarium provides an exact match scientifically and is dated to the 6th century, so the provenance is known. We have a possible new mechanism, which is the bipolar jets, the matter and antimatter coming together, forming the gamma radiation, and this might have had this holographic reverberation, that universal. So this may be the true message of not salvation through death and resurrection, but because this is a tortured person, don't you feel bad about yourself? But it may have been that this kick-started a golden age. And if you think about it, there were many people at that time who actually were going on about that they were the Messiah, or being hailed as the Messiah, as a true... why is it this particular person who actually died a horrible death, you know, if this is to believe, if Jesus died a horrible death, why is he remembered? There must have been something about his death that distinguished him from all the other preachers that were there at the time. And whether or not this is a resurrection. So I don't think Christianity originated as a message of torture and suffering, but this could be a multi-dimensional message, that this is actually the body of this person actually becoming into gamma radiation, and something quite extraordinary happening. Okay, so I think maybe without the shroud, Jesus might even have been forgotten without this happening. So I want to end it there. There's quite a lot that I've said. So here's to a new, a new theory. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that. I know it's a lot to throw at you tonight.
Let's show our appreciation. Quite the end of Colombo, really. I'll show you how. We've got about another 5 or 6 minutes, so if anyone wants to ask questions, if anyone wants to...
People have been asking questions all along.
Yeah, resurrection is a process that takes place in life, not after death.
It takes place
in life, not after death. Lest a man be reborn, only then can he enter the kingdom of heaven. It's not a physical death, it's a psychological one.
I think the reborn word actually has been proved to be a mistranslation. If you look at it, it's not reborn.
I'm talking from personal experience.
Oh,
not
I see,
academic
right.
research.
Sorry, in this presentation, I don't mean at all to offend anybody.
No, you weren't offending me. It's the misinterpretation of words.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I don't mean to offend anybody at all if they will. Okay.
Anything else? That was a sentence.
Yeah, so I studied transmutation, which is a similar sort of process that's going on across the world. There's a lot of evidence right now that people, even today, are going through this process. And it just seems to me that the concept of the black hole principle is actually very similar.
It's the same thing, yeah. It's different words in different religions. The resurrection in Buddhism is enlightenment, in Taoism it's finding the Tao, in Hinduism it's finding the Atman. You know, they've all got a word for it. It's not about after you die, it's during life.
Okay. Yeah, which means that he could have been, this person, whoever it is, could have been alive, so there's a possibility.
Yeah, two questions, if you don't mind. One is, if that process does work, has it been demonstrated elsewhere?
Sorry, I didn't hear if that person...
If that process does work, of, you know, the transformation of gamma reverse or whatever, if that does work, if that is your thesis that you put forward, has it been demonstrated anywhere else with another body here?
Well, I think James just said about the people have been found having gone through this transmutation process. Whether or not that's that.
But has it been documented? And have we seen anything like this?
I don't know. This is totally unique. Nobody's ever found anything like this with this holographic information embedded in an image. No, people have talked about. James has done some research, and he's talked about bodies just disappearing. And people meditating for a long time, but as far as we know, we haven't found an image like that. I mean, there may be some person in India who's created such an image, and we just don't know about it. So.
Okay. And my other question, going back to Zeitgeist, one of the things that they mention in there is that the story of Jesus Christ predates Jesus Christ. Through other religions. I'm not knocking, the jury's out as far as I'm concerned. Even if Jesus Christ didn't exist 2,000 years ago, my personal belief is that the teachings are very valuable anyway. But how do you explain the fact that those stories predate Jesus?
Well, it's interesting, as I said, Professor Bart Ehrman has just brought out this new book talking about this, and I haven't. At the moment, I've got an open mind. I haven't read the entire book yet because it's only just come out. But he does talk about how a lot of the mythicists go back to this idea of just exactly what you said, but it goes back about 200 years. So there's some books that came out about 200 years ago talking about this, and a lot of people reference that. I have started to look into the references of Acharya S. And sorry that I'm only at the beginning of the research. There's a lot of research for this book, and I have also found that she's making some mistakes. Like she talks about the Bishop Irenaeus being a Gnostic, and that starts for me to start questioning things. But
there is kind of other documentation.
Yes. About Bishop Irenaeus being a Gnostic?
About the fact that the story of Jesus Christ predates Jesus Christ, like
Sure.
Zoroaster and
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. The argument that I read, sorry, I've not done all the research yet, but basically people are saying that's not true, that we haven't got any evidence for that, and that evidence only goes back 200 years. So, I've still got an open mind myself, because I really have to, I totally agree with you, there's some pagan elements, the communion, the Holy Mass, the Holy Communion, these are all Roman things. The idea of eating the body of Jesus would be a total anathema, because according to Judaism, that's cannibalism. Eating the blood of Jesus, drinking the blood of Jesus, these have all come from pagan rites. So there's a lot of paganism in Christianity, absolutely. So
I was just wondering, with your theory, are you planning to try it out by experiment at any point?
If that kind of happens to me through meditation, I'll let you know. I mean, it's that last bit, as I said, it is speculative. It's just very interesting to me that I've been studying the black hole data, all the data of the black hole principle, that this happens at every single level. I think what could happen with a person who is meditating to such a degree and is the antimatter and matter, because the antimatter is actually the shadow emotions. This is what I've been talking about. So in our own lives, the black hole principle works as it's our shadow emotions. So somebody who is extremely sort of a realised soul, extremely enlightened, may actually transcend death and be able to bring those two together. So perhaps this is what's happening. I know that Buddhist monks have got a lot of techniques where they're actually even able to produce fire from their own bodies. These are people that are living today. There's a lot of techniques that are out there that are kept secretive. So, at the moment I've got no plans to test it out, but, I'm definitely going to do some more research on it.
You said that the body was covered in aloe vera, yeah?
According to the gospel.
Yeah. In Jamaica, we call that Cinco Bible.
You call it?
Cinco Bible.
Oh.
Yeah, we call it Cinco Bible. So a spiritual reference is actually there. And yes, a chemical reaction could have actually taken place because there is molecules of positiveness within cloth anyway, you see. So in regards to spirituality, what goes on there, it's significant.
I mean, the book that talks about this is called The Jesus Conspiracy, and they tried to reproduce that image, and they had some success, but whether or not the image was exactly the same, like it, because people have been able to produce images, but has it got the holographic information? Has it got? So I think reading the book and it might be quite interesting for you to see, if the sweat and the aloe theory is.
Well, there's definitely some sort of chemical.
Yes, there's definitely a reaction that happens. Sorry, this gentleman.
I know you come from a medical and scientific background, but what drew you to the Turin Shroud in the first place? Of all the artifacts or all the things in the world that you could maybe investigate, why did you choose the Turin Shroud?
Well, for this new book, actually I started, as I said, having these visions and going, okay, what's all this about? It actually started when I was with somebody else and we had a joint vision. And so, in fact, the first few were actually a joint vision. I've actually been inside Mary Magdalene's consciousness as she's giving birth to a second child. So heard her thoughts, so I was like going, okay, that's interesting, what's all that about? Not really thinking about it. Then the Da Vinci Code came out, and I mean, for me, Mary Magdalene was a completely, minor figure in my life. I wasn't brought up as a Christian. I went off and did all my science work, And I actually discovered the Gnostic Gospels. So the black hole principle, interestingly, is in the Gnostic Gospels, which, as some people know, they talk about the goddess Sophia falling from the centre of the galaxy, reaching the cosmic bound, and then creating the world. And what the cosmic bound is, is the perception horizon, the speed of light in the black hole principle. We now have the data, so I went off and brought all this data without knowing it was already something in existence in the Gnostic Gospels in a mythic form. But it's there, it's actually the same thing. So I went off and did all this research, and then I started to realise that these visions are actually leading somewhere. The Gnostic Gospels, this is Gnostic knowledge, and so looking at the Gnostic Gospels, I realised that as a spiritual person, I could make sense of it. It's talking about different realms of consciousness, the teachings that are in the Gnostic Gospels and other teachings. I can actually make sense of it as a spiritual person. And I realised that a lot of the knowledge, such as the God of the Old Testament is not the true God, which comes out of the Gnostic Gospel, really resonates with me. So part of my research is to actually look, well, did Jesus exist then? And so if you're looking at that, you have to look at the Shroud of Turin is one of the things that interested me. Just watching a TV documentary, and I started to look at the science, and the more I went into it, the more it sort of interested me, and I realised there's more to it than, we're often told. So, a bit of a convoluted answer, sorry.
I'm afraid we have to say thanks very much.